Well, all right, my friends, let's do this. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap. Got a great interview with Evan Friss for you. I will share that in a moment. I'm sitting here on the weekend before the Trump administration, the second Trump Reich, begins on Monday, but also the moment where apparently they're going to ban TikTok. I wonder what you all think about that and how they might be related. I don't know. I feel a weird sense of exhaustion, not just in myself, but in the larger zeitgeist. I'm seeing a lot of stuff on social media of people that are just like, I'm out, I'm done, I don't care. Who gives a fuck about all this stuff? Like a kind of, I don't know, a collective unwillingness to take the clickbait that is the TikTok video and that is the Trump administration, because they're already releasing their little Stephen Miller Nazi plans of doing all these immigration raids. And there's something, I don't know, there's something sad about it. The New York Times has a bunch of charts and polls out this morning that say that most Americans don't really support the grosser ends of the Trump agenda. And there's sort of like a center, there's like a kind of a center-right thing going on in this country, in the majority at least. And I don't know. I don't know how the second term is going to go. I myself don't really have the patience for all of the fake news and screaming headlines and performative outrage, even the like liberal hashtag resistance. I'm longing for always, a wider view, a slower take on things. That's part of the reason why we like to cover, when we do our News Trap episodes, and this is certainly Justin Rogers Cooper's obsession, we like to cover the legacy media. We like to read books, and that's part of what our episode today will be about. But when I say legacy media, I don't mean like, I just want to read the New York Times and believe what they're saying. It's more about like reading the particularly the financial press, like the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal, doing that Chomsky thing of figuring out like what are capitalists saying? How are the like macroeconomic factors determining the direction of things? Because I just don't want to be subjected to the whims of a kind of clickbait economy of media, and you can really feel. I think it was actually my dad who said this to me. I've been going to coffees with my dad every Thursday recently since he turned 80. And we've been talking a lot about Trump stuff, obviously. But one of the things he said to me is that, how carefully Trump controls the media by this sort of like slow drip of spectacular or offensive news, right? And it's just like, yeah, I don't want to take the bait on any of that. I don't want to be a fool. And when I look at a lot of social media in particular, of people that are just sort of like taking the bait and being like, did you hear what Trump said? Did you hear what he's going to do? I don't care. I don't want to be subjected to that. And I certainly don't want to have my kind of emotional well-being connected to it. So, as TikTok gets banned, and I've never been a big TikTok guy, but I know 90% of the country is tapped into that shit, like kind of their own slow drip of dopamine. I wonder, how that will change things. I don't expect things to change all that much, honestly, because people will still get their social media fix from other places. But I'm wondering what it means in kind of the larger direction. Like, are people exhausted with this stuff? Is the Trump spell not going to work in the same way that it did before? Or am I totally wrong and Trump's going to, be able to enforce his violent, nasty vision on Americans? I feel like it might just be boring. One of my, signal memories of childhood for some reason, not even childhood, maybe in my high school years, was Bill Clinton's second inauguration. I remember sitting in my orthodontist office reading either Time magazine or Newsweek, and they were reporting on the fact that nobody showed up for Clinton's second inauguration. Nobody cared. It was the most boring thing in the world. And I can't help but feel that that's part of what Trump's inauguration and second term may be like. It may be much more boring than we expect. Either way, we're going to keep rocking and rolling on Nostalgia Trap, and we appreciate everyone that supports the show and listens to the show. And I'm sure we'll have much to say about it next week. Justin will join me again for a news trap, and we'll have some other commentators on that I'm very excited to bring you next week. So stay tuned for that. But today, I'm talking with Evan Friss. Evan Friss is the author of a book that's out right now called The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore. I read it this week. I really, really enjoyed it. It sort of touches on, obviously, something very near and dear to my heart, and probably a lot of listeners out there too. I imagine you're book readers too. And the bookshop occupies this very specific place, not only in American history, but in the larger landscape of American consumer capitalism. You know that going into a bookshop, particularly an indie bookshop, an independently owned place, you feel a certain kind of feeling that you don't get in any other store. And Evan wrote a really, really smart book that investigates what that feeling is and how bookstores have shaped this country's history. There is so much fun in this book, and I had a really fun time talking with him. And you will learn that Evan is someone that I went to school with at the City University of New York Graduate Center. We were both in the history PhD program at the same time many years ago, and I remember him in this dissertation seminar we took. We talk a little bit about that, but it's just great to hear from him because he's written a book that I think is not only about something I love, but is sort of a model of how to do history and how to present it in a popular way. So this was a really fun book. Again, it's called The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore. And I wanted to say, again, thank you to everyone who is listening to the show and supporting the show on Patreon. There is a link in every episode description for you to do that. I appreciate we are an independent operation ourselves, totally listener supported. So whenever I get an email every once in a while that says someone has subscribed and someone is giving you $1 or $5 or whatever it might be, it's inspiring. I don't want to be corny, but it makes me feel like, wow, I need to get up to the microphone and do another podcast and do it better and get better at this. So I appreciate everyone who supports the show. Thank you so much, and enjoy this interview. This is me talking with Evan Friss. Evan Friss, good to see you. Thank you for joining me. How are you?
I'm doing well. Likewise. Thanks for having me on.
I was going through a local bookshop a couple weeks ago and saw your book, and it caught my eye because it has a really cool cover. And then I realized, wait a second, that name looks really familiar. And I remembered that you and I were in a dissertation seminar at the City University of New York Graduate Center many years ago when you were working on a manuscript about bicycles, and that was a really memorable piece of writing. And I know you developed that into a couple books, right? You wrote a couple books about bicycles.
That's right. One advantage of having an unusual last name is that it's recognizable and that people now see coming across it are like, that is the guy, now people are in the age of Google have to think about what they're naming their child so they can, if they at least achieve a moderate amount of fame, they yield a kind of first page on Google search results. But yes, I remember that class as well. And I thought you had the best book idea of the whole class. That's honestly what I remember.
Oh
And there was
man.
it was a great idea. And were a good writer. And it was kind of a weird class. And it had light supervision, is how I would describe it.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually remember the professor of that class sort of like looking at your work on bicycles and being like, what are we writing about bicycles for? And I was like sitting there being like, dude, what Evan is doing is really important because I was writing about coffee houses and I think he had a similar attitude.
Yeah.
But yeah, to me, like writing about culture and little objects of pop culture as icons of larger phenomenon was really where I wanted to be. But that's not everyone's
Yeah.
preference in American history programs.
No, I think we're trained to gravitate towards subjects with gravitas or what's seemingly trending or what's striking an intellectual nerve. And I remember in graduate school trying too hard to sound smart and trying to sort of, attach my own personal and scholarly interests with what seemed to be important to other people. And thankfully, by the time I was sort of finishing up or got to that class, and in the years after, gave up on that and found myself, I don't know, finding more problems with traditional scholarly discourse in academia than being desperate to sort of appeasing the intellectual taste of that particular professor.
Yeah, and the particular like language, I felt a real because I didn't know the language, and so I felt I needed to talk a certain way and use certain words and deploy certain concepts. And yeah, I really what that getting to your book, I mean, that's what I really appreciate about it. It's called The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore. And what I like about it, many things. I really enjoyed it. It was super fun to read, and it made me want to open a bookshop because there's a kind of a there's a, like, minor proselytization going on where you're sort of like talking about the bookshop as a very important part of American history and culture. But one of the things I liked about it and appreciated is what it is not an academic jargony book that's like talking about the bookshop as this particular piece of American capitalism. But at the same time, there's a sly and kind of devastating thesis at the core of your book about what the importance of bookshops and what they've done and how they've shaped American life. So I just really appreciated it and wanted to start by just telling you I really liked your book. It was fun to read.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I had intended the book, or I mean, I think many of us historians dream of having lay readers and general public interest, and it can be hard to achieve, but that was my goal. And I also feel like it really isn't that much different from anything I wrote in graduate school, where my first two books, which were published by university presses, this book has over 1,000 endnotes. They're just hidden in the text. And, but it's still based on scholarly research. And one thing I did appreciate about our PhD program was there were models of people doing this kind of history. And my advisor was David Nassau.
Yep.
And I can remember very vividly him telling me to write the dissertation like a book. And he wasn't interested in some of the kind of typical kinds of apparatus that you might see in
Yeah.
scholarly work, and very long historiography. And, he was really into, even for a dissertation, telling a story through crisp writing and interesting anecdotes and finding the kind of best pieces of evidence. So, um, my hope for this book was to marry the kind of scholarly training and deep kind of archival research and sensitive interpretation and all that with, a story that is interesting and captivating enough, and not have any of that kind of jargon laden material to turn off people who I think are interested in bookstores and go to bookstores, but maybe haven't really thought about the kind of power that they hold and have held.
Yeah. I mean, Nassau was the first guy that I encountered at the graduate center when I went there on a visit, like a campus visit, to see if I could go to this school. And he had the same appeal to me. He was like, he was telling me about the students that he was advising that were writing things about plays and books and movies, and he sort of had a kind of different take that drew me to the graduate center. I didn't end up working with NASA. I think we actually had him on this podcast years ago, and in his office when I was in New York. But yeah, that's the approach that I really appreciate. I wanted to ask you because we talk about nostalgia a lot. Just to start talking about bookshops, um, what were bookshops to you like growing up? Like, did you have particular bookshops that were meaningful to you? Because reading this book, all I could do was realize it made me realize that there are like specific moments of my own, not even intellectual, but like just like kind of personal development that I can pinpoint as like that happened at a bookshop at a particular place.
Yeah.
Were there ones that were important to you growing up?
Not as much as you would think as having written the book. So I grew up largely, I was born in New York, but mostly raised in suburban Baltimore in Columbia, Maryland, which is an interesting suburb that has a long and history of its own. Started by this guy named James Rouse, who was famous for building malls, but had this idea of like creating this very progressive, different kind of suburb in the utopian 1960s. But my experience with bookstores was largely chain bookstores, which I went to and liked, and there was a Crown Books in my neighborhood, but it didn't have the same appeal to me as like the local video store, which in some ways is a kind of a similar kind of institution. And
Hmm.
it was really more like the video store that I think was my experience that people had with bookstores, where there was the kind of quirky guy who worked behind there who seemed to know everything about indie film. And we talked to him, and he was a kind of wizard behind some curtain. Um, and I had a Barnes and Noble that I went to and enjoyed. But for me, it was more the kind of video store and also the public library. That was a place where I enjoyed spending time and have very fond and clear memories of finding books and delighting in the stacks and becoming a kind of more adventurous reader as I matured and going there. There wasn't a sort of great bookstore for me growing up. And it was only after I moved to New York, um, and I started at NYU in this public history program, and I thought I might want to be an archivist. And I was living in the Village, and my wife got a job at Three Lives and Company. And so it was really then, as a 20 something person who was reading a lot at the time and really interested in books, that I began to spend a lot of time in indie bookstores, mostly Three Lives, but also I paid more attention to the other ones. Um, so it came sort of later in life rather than a childhood experience, the kind of magnetism of bookstores.
Yeah, I think that tracks with me too because I was raised in suburbs and went to the mall bookstores a lot. And you talk about the mall bookstores, Walden Books and Crown
Yeah.
Books. It's weird. It's weird because I'm almost it's weird to be nostalgic for the kind of corporate bookstore even because they disappeared. Like there was a mall bookstore that opened in our big mall here just a couple years ago, and it didn't survive. It was only there for about 5 years, but it made me realize how much the bookstore was a part of the mall. That was like a thing. It's not really anymore. You don't see those little bookstores.
No, well, and the whole mall kind of concept is fraying.
That's true.
That's the best way of saying it. But yeah, and I think then the nostalgia for bookstores, even for in the subsequent decline of bookstores, people, and there's no shame, I don't think, of having fond memories of going to Barnes and Noble or Crown or B. Dalton. And it speaks to the kind of resurgence that Barnes and Noble has experienced. And I write a little bit about in the book. And a lot of people who are our age are surprised by the kind of relative alliance that exists between indie bookstores and Barnes and Noble these days, because of course Amazon entered the scene in the intervening years, and now people would kind of long for a chain bookstore in a way because it's still a bookstore or a mall bookstore, regardless of its kind of corporate nature. It seems today, again, in the wake of Amazon, as a very healthy, certainly innocuous, and maybe even great and, a healthy part of our retail ecosystem that many of us would long for.
Well, it seems like an idea that's at the core of your book is this sort of like the bookshop as this paradox. that's both a retail store selling items, dependent on making money and being a kind of consumer outpost. But at the same time, it occupies this sort of like no zone of like, I wouldn't call it necessarily anti-capitalist, but you do cover some of the radical bookstores of the 1960s and 1970s that were based on Black power and feminism and gay rights. And they had sort of ideas and values that were counter to the mainstream vision of what consumer capitalism is. And it's weird because it feels like, yeah, there's like a kind of middle space. Because when you're writing about Amazon, it's like, whoa, they took it so far into just being crass consumerism that it
Mhm.
lost something, right? And I'm wondering like how much of this book was, well, kind of where did you get the idea for this book? But kind of how much of this book was conceived as a sort of writing about that idea, that particular weird space that bookshops occupy, particularly in the moment we're in now.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was me trying to sort of articulate how a bookstore is different from other stores. And um, it is, it is very unique. And some of it is this notion of spreading ideas and selling books is somehow different than selling almost anything else
Mm,
because it has this good-natured sense to it, this idea that's rooted in education and knowledge and empowering people. So there's always been, since the very beginnings of booksellings, a tension between running a business and doing something that is seemingly for some kind of greater good. And those tensions mount and grow from generation to generation for various different reasons, but they're always there, and they're still there today. And it's a very oft romanticized occupation because people
mm,
love reading. So it's like, oh, I'll just go and open a bookstore. And there are a lot of people who do, which again creates these kind of differences between other kinds of retail outlets. And there's a line in the book, and it's one of my favorite, the interviews I did was with this guy who'd worked in a lot of bookstores. And he said, bookstores are weird. and that was his kind of
yeah.
summation of a long career. He was a regular worker in many bookstores. And then it's like, yeah, they are weird. They operate in this very strange space that's stuck between capitalism and this sort of ideology of goodness. And there are, of course, other, so-called third spaces. And you wrote a great book that I read many years ago when it first came out, Dangerous Grounds. That's what it's
Yeah.
called,
Yeah.
right?
Thank you. Yeah.
Um, obviously coffee shop. There are places where people like to inhabit and rub shoulders, and in the case that you illuminate, start protest or at least foment protests, important kinds of spaces. But there's something very unique about the business of literature, of books, which universally is sort of beloved even by people who don't read. Um, so it's been a kind of strange journey, and they now there are bookstores, some of which that are operating as not for profits, who see their role more explicitly as providing a service to the culture and community.
Mm.
So they're minimizing the profit motive in very explicit ways, including some very famous bookstores like the Seminary Co-op in Chicago, as well as a bunch of others.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it did remind me of the GI coffee houses, in particular in the chapters about what the Drum and Spear Coffee House or
Mhm.
Drum and Spear Bookshop is that in DC, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the problems that they encountered, and that was like a Black liberation bookshop. The problems
Mhm.
that you write about that they encountered were so. It was kind of like, yeah, we got to make up our mind at one point. Like, are we a revolutionary sort of outpost, or are we trying to survive financially? And it seemed like those with I mean, with the coffee houses, they were just a bunch of like Marxists and socialists, and they
Yeah.
were like, we're not gonna, cater to any kind of need to make money here, and that just like it just killed them. And it's interesting because it seems like you do have to have some balance. The most successful coffee houses that I wrote about were the ones that had some sort of way to make money. Honestly, they had concerts. They brought in books that people wanted to read beyond just anti-capitalist revolutionary literature. But it seems like that's kind of at the heart of it. I think the most heartening part of your book is reading the chapter on Amazon when they tried to open brick and mortar stores and it just didn't work. Can you explain like why do you think it didn't work? Because I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. So, there were lots of people speculating about this venture in the first place. Like, what were they doing? And people, again, our generation, think of Amazon as a bookstore. That's how they started. But my college students don't think of Amazon at all as a bookstore.
Yeah,
And many of
right.
them don't even know that Amazon began with books. It's just this online behemoth that sells everything. So it seemed strange in many ways for them to get back into the game. And they started with a couple of dozen stores, which again, this was going to be such a small market. It was one thing that Amazon wants to get into the grocery business, which it has experimented with and tried because the market is obviously so big, but it
Hmm.
already sells probably more than half the books that Americans buy. So like, why is it trying to pick up 24 little stores? And like, what is this really about? And most people thought it was just another kind of data, a place to pick up data about customers, and there were certain kinds of customers. I'm not really sure. I wonder how much of it was just ego of, the Amazon people saying, we started this business to sort of compete with and destroy the brick and mortar businesses. We've done that very successfully. Now let's just corner both markets as a kind of bravado way. I'm not entirely sure. And it was very hard to interview people at Amazon. I did interview one person who was in charge of, or one of the people in charge of the brick and mortar stores off the record, which was pretty insightful. But they were just strange. I mean, I'm not surprised they didn't work because they were odd. And if you went to one, it was a kind of hodgepodge half bookstore. And people who like bookstores generally like bookstores, and even Barnes and Noble has trimmed a lot of the sidelines and non-book stuff so that their new stores read like a bookstore. And the Amazon stores were, two-thirds bookstore and one-third gadget mania place with all these Amazon products.
Mm.
And my favorite kind of anecdote about the store of how Amazon is just off because it's not a bookstore was when I went to the one in Bethesda, Maryland, this very affluent suburb of Washington, D.C. There was a bay of books, and it was titled If You Like Nonfiction. And it was a bay full of nonfiction books. And I thought, why not just call it nonfiction? Which is what most other bookstores do. It was like if it was this kind of gobbledygook of
Yeah.
some weird marketing attempt. I don't know, but it just was very strange and inhuman, and there weren't readers necessarily big readers working there, and it seemed to capture none of the essence of what the hardcore bookstore demographic appreciates about a bookstore. So I wasn't terribly surprised they failed. I mean, one question was, are they just going to keep doing them? I don't know, for sort of sport, but Amazon doesn't like to lose money either. So I don't want to say it was inevitable. And it either was going to blow up and there were going to be, 600 of them, and they were going to try and basically eliminate Barnes and Noble, or they were just an experiment I'm not sure. But I didn't really talk to anybody who liked them. Um, And I'd walk
Yeah.
around, I'd talk to people there, and the people that I happened to just meet anecdotally at the few that I visited were often there to do returns, which I mentioned in the book. They got an Amazon thing, and this was just a kind of convenient depot in
Yeah.
some way for
Well,
Amazon, not a
well, I
bookstore.
mean, it's missing the element of weird. I mean, it's what's funny about your book and what I found I think might have been challenging if I was thinking about, how you would approach this subject. Because it is some sort of, I'm glad you said like that your goal was to articulate something because it is hard to articulate what is the element of a bookshop that draws people in, but because it's I don't know. There's like you can feel how cold an Amazon bookshop is. Like it doesn't
Yeah.
have that love. Like it doesn't have that weird, quirky element. I don't know. I don't know what it is, but it feels like your book by profiling all of these different bookshops at different points in American history sort of gets at it through stories, and gets at it through, particular practices and particular people, which I really loved. Like reading about the book owner, which is the bookstore owner is a very particular type of person
Yeah.
that's not quite the record store guy. But there is like I don't know. I found them all to be fascinating characters, but there's kind of a curmudgeonly thing going on there. They're not always like the most like lovable people, it seems like, right?
Not at all. And I profile in the book perhaps two of the most influential and important, certainly first half of the 20th century booksellers were women in this male dominated industry. But one was Frances Stelloff at the Gotham Book Mart, and the other Marcella Burns Honor at Marshall Field, which would be like the corporate behemoth at the time. And they were tastemakers. They were hugely influential. They could make a book or kill a book.
Hmm.
And they created very different, but very popular and admired bookstores. And they had their own personalities, but a lot of people who, went to Gotham Book Mart or worked there didn't say that Francis Deloff was like the most huggable kind of person. People could feel, it was this place that people were attracted to in some ways, but they could also feel intimidated in other ways, like
Totally.
they're out of their element and there's all this kind of weird stuff and modernist literature and avant-garde poetry. And what am I supposed to ask for? And if you ask for the wrong kind of thing, maybe you would be, snickered at or something. So, um, there's no, single. And then there's other people like Craig Rodwell, who started Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop, who barely read anything.
Love that
Started the
chapter.
bookstore
Yeah.
because he was an activist, and this seemed like a way, a conduit to achieve what he wanted. But he wasn't a bookish person, and if you ask people who knew him, he never really became one. He wasn't this what you would think of as maybe conjure up the image of some very bookish intellectual type who's just quiet and timid and wears a sweater,
Right.
behind
Right.
the bookstore. This was not him. So it was fun to think about the different kind of, you know, personalities of the owners, but also of the shops. And I tried to highlight the kind of different, archetypes and models that were popular at different times. And in so many ways, the shop was was some part of the owner. They were one, and Craig Rodwell could not be divorced from his shop. And Francis Stelloff was the Gotham Book Mart in
Yeah.
so many ways. And when they left and died, the shops were never the same.
That's interesting to think about it that way. That they're kind of like outgrowths of certain personality types and certain that had missions one way or the other. That chapter on the Oscar Wilde, the part that you write about where there was like a telephone. This was like a gay bookstore in it was at the West Village. Is that where it
Yeah,
was? Yeah.
Mercer Street. It moved locations then to Christopher Street, but yes,
Yeah.
West Village.
Yeah, that there was a telephone in there that was kind of served as a hotline for like gay kids to call in from around the country, and like whoever picks up the phone just like talks to them about like what it's like to be gay in New York City, where you could sort of have more of a life than perhaps you could in other parts of the country. I think that is another thing that maybe young people today would be like, what are you talking about? Like
Yeah,
all of that seems so foreign. But I think, I don't know, you and I are probably the age where we can kind of identify a little bit with that. The idea that like, there was no internet, and there was no sort of idea that you could just find this information about another life. And just God, the function of the bookstore as a kind of place that really reached out in that way was just, I don't know. It was
yeah.
quite
There
an
weren't,
image. Yeah.
safe spaces and
Right.
LGBTQ centers. And so, where do people go for information? Where do people go for community? And his bookstore became nationally known as a haven for gay people. Obviously, it was a bookstore, and many of the people were interested in the literature, but they're also going through the archives and his papers, which are at the New York Public Library. So much of the correspondence has nothing to do with books.
Mm.
It's just here's some kid who knows that Craig Rodwell is gay and is an activist and started this bookstore, and he has an address to the bookstore and figures he seems like a guy. He started this gay bookstore. He must know something. He must be the guy to ask about these problems I'm having. Um, and it was a mecca. People who'd never been to New York ask for jobs and say, I'm looking for a way to get to New York and the village, which seemed like, a much more ideal place to live than wherever they were currently living, and were desperate for jobs, for information about, how to settle in, where they could live, all this kind of information that again really had nothing to do with books or the bookstore, but that was the enterprise for this really amazing space. And there were, books that people could get through mail order things, which obviously wasn't the internet, but this was a very different kind of institution that Rodwell wanted to be very visible. And the first location on had these big windows. People thought he was nuts. He's
Mm.
like, isn't this going to be underground or some kind of, bathhouse kind of space or gay bar that's, behind this door? And he was like, no, this is going to be a very above board, legitimate, which is what he thought books offered, a kind of legitimacy to the movement and intellectual kind of support. And there was going to be windows and people would look at
Yeah.
right off the street. And that was the point.
Yeah, and what it wasn't like a porno place, basically. I mean, it's funny because the term adult bookstore, I think, is another kind of institution that maybe young people don't know too much about, but that you kind of knew that it's an adult bookstore. Wink, wink. This is where you get erotic material and things like that. But Rodwell's Oscar Wilde bookstore is not that. It's something very different.
Yeah. And I had at one point thought about including a chapter on adult bookstores, but the records are surprisingly thin, and
Mm,
I didn't know about the readership and how exactly I was going to go about doing it. But also fascinating spaces themselves, often open 24 hours. There was, famously dens of them in Times Square at
yeah.
one point or another.
Well, I mean, the moral element is there with and the New York element, that kind of like 80s New York, comes out in your chapter about sidewalk booksellers, which was a part of New York City that I was around when I first got to New York in 2003, and I had never seen that before. Again, coming from the suburbs, I'd never seen like just a row of card tables set up with people selling books on the street, and it was like very, very charming to me. But I didn't realize even, I mean, reading your book was the first time I'd really thought about the political economy, and I appreciate that you don't use the term political economy in this book. But the first time I thought about like, wow, there's a story to that. And of course, at some point, it's weird because at some point there was like a kind of moral outrage about the sidewalk sellers, right? Is that in the Giuliani years that happens?
Yeah, so sort of, there are one of the weird things. New York isn't just the biggest city, but there are some unusual things. And there are things like bike messengers where they exist in other cities, but there aren't enough of them really to affect the landscape like they do in New York. And some of that
Hmm.
is about size and density. And the book selling is a little bit about that, but it's also about politics. So it was during the Koch administration, somebody just sued the city, this poet who was hawking his poems in Washington Square Park on a kind of First Amendment thing. And the legal gymnastics here seems quite involved. I don't quite know how this happened, but there was a an impulse in the 80s to grant booksellers, anyone selling written material, a kind of free path to doing so and not have to go through this very onerous system of getting a vendor license in New York. So it created an anomalous situation where in New York and New York alone, basically with very few restrictions, anybody could set up a table so long as they were selling books or magazines. And they just, everybody who was on the wait list to sell hot dogs or whatever. A lot of them just jumped to books, as well as people who had wanted to sell books from the beginning. So it created this enormous um, number of sidewalk bookstores in New York that didn't exist anywhere else. And their quick proliferation created this backlash. And there was a whole lot of rhetoric about the morality of selling books on the sidewalks, but mostly it was about the kind of people
Hmm.
who were doing it. And I mentioned bike messengers because I wrote about bikes, and there's a lot of similarities here about the condemnation of these kinds of people that are mucking up New York City by their kind of slovenly nature, and the suggestions that these people are all stealing things and that they're criminals.
Yeah,
And
they're street people, right? And it's like
yeah, exactly.
put with the like the squeegee men and all that kind of
Yes.
culture that
So there
people were like,
becomes
yeah.
an effort
Hmm.
to clean up the streets, which involves getting rid of squeegee men, clamping down on bike messengers and trying to eradicate or at least make life more difficult for the sidewalk booksellers, which they do. And the business gradually declines. And there's a whole host of other kind of 21st century problems, like people, I write briefly in the book, but now it's hard to imagine anybody noticing, where everybody's walking around with their cell phones and ear pods and everything else. Like, this used to be a very visible and yeah, visible part of life. But I was fascinated by them. So when I moved to New York, this was in 2003, there were a bunch of still Washington Square Park sidewalk sellers.
Yep.
And I would go there and talk to them and look at the tables, and they were regular customers. And it was this, and that was well after the heyday
Hmm.
of the
Yeah.
1980s. But they gradually just kind of declined, and I missed their presence and wanted to write about what I thought was a really interesting kind of bookstore that wasn't traditionally conceived as such. And one of the interesting things about it was that the traditional booksellers, who we often portray as these, very well-meaning, liberal, even if they're capitalists, they're sort of nice capitalists.
Hmm.
They were at the charge to get rid of sidewalk booksellers.
Yeah, I would think so. That's competition, right? And they're selling them for cheap too.
Yeah, they would often allege that their books had been stolen, they were on the sidewalks, and they weren't paying taxes and all this kind of stuff.
Well, So two things. For my first like romantic wow bookshop moment was after college, on a road trip. I drove up to Portland, Oregon and went to Powell's. And I remember being in there and like I grabbed a book. I remember the book. The book was about like Andy Kaufman, who I didn't know much about. Andy
Yeah.
Kaufman was like a in the 90s was like a hip thing. I don't know if
Yeah.
people care anymore. But like I grabbed a book on Andy Kaufman, I sat down, I got a coffee at their cafe, and I felt I'm a cosmopolitan adult now. Like I'm a
Yeah.
real person here. And I had that similar feeling when I discovered the Strand when I got to New York City, because it's kind of like Powell's. And I think you mentioned there are only a couple bookstores, independent bookstores like that are that scale. They're huge places.
Yeah.
But I was surprised, maybe not surprised, because I've read some of the controversies about in your chapter about the Strand, because it's sort of a there's a kind of controversial history to that place. That place is a little bit more of the combination of things you're talking about in the book, the capitalist bookseller, the big economy of books, and then the balance of that with that kind of like, I don't know, hip aesthetic. And I reading the Strand chapter, I was like, wow, these are like the Strand owners are kind of like the cool kids a little bit, and that part of it annoyed me a little bit about the Strand as I lived in New York for longer, because it really drew me in with the romance. Like that's the place that you get lost in the stacks,
Yeah.
and I still love the Strand. But it seems like it's also just the a place that has come up to some of those contradictions you get at in the book.
Yeah, and there's a very, it's 100 years old almost, the shop. So, and it's now a third generation family business. And the now grandfather of the woman, Nancy Bass Wyden, who runs it, he came from nothing and it was this little stall and he failed the first time and then he built this shop and it was really the kind of second generation owner, his son, and the current owner's father, Fred, who decided to leave Fourth Avenue, which was known as Book Row, which was a line of used bookstores, dozens and dozens of secondhand shops, and build a kind of bigger store. And over time, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. So it became like Powell's, which is also a family business, much more successful and the scale was enormous. It became unlike the books other any other bookstore or the bookstore that it once was. And so it's just a very different kind of thing running this business now in the Strand or Powell's, which is a national brand. These are the
Yeah.
two independent bookstores that my mom has heard of before I wrote this book, or that people coming to visit the States, they go see the Statue of Liberty, the World Trade Center site memorial, and they go to the Strand as a destination. And there are people who have strong feelings about that, whether that's a good thing or bad thing. I mean, I happen to think anybody going to any bookstore is a positive. And, the
Yeah, I agree.
Strand,
Yeah. I
the
see the
number of
tote
people,
bags here in Ventura, California.
yeah,
I'll see a Strand tote bag and I'll smile and be like, yeah. In the same way
yeah,
I think about like Amoeba record stuff. It's just kind of like, yeah,
yes.
it's a huge brand, but there's something very cool about the fact that there's a huge brand of like books and records.
Yes. And
Yeah.
there are booksellers out there who are not such fans of the scale or all of the merch. Um, you know, and I understand where they're coming from. And there's some union stuff that, comes and goes in terms of when it flares. And so on the one hand, there are people with certain politics who rail against the owner, and I understand where they're coming from. On the other hand, their employees are unionized, which is very unusual for not just a bookstore but a retail, operation. So, despite the consternation and the difficulties and whatever problems there are, it's still a place where um, a lot of their employees are unionized and um, I think it's an amazing institution and it's different than some bookstores and it's not for if I am only going to New York and going to go to one bookstore, it's not going to be my first choice. I can get overwhelmed by the size, and
Hmm.
I prefer something a little more scaled down. But I appreciate what it offers and its history, that it's been able to stay in business for 100 years, and it's changed shape. Um,
New
but
York would not be the same place if I ever heard that the Strand was closing up. There would be a hole in New York and
yeah,
in sort of my idea of New York for sure.
and then the number of people that I've met on sort of book tour for this project, or just talk to or interview, who say, "Oh, I love that," who just volunteer. Like when they think about this subject matter, they think about the Strand. Every time I go to New York, I go to the Strand. Or um and I did an event there for this book and was very happy to do so, because I think it's such an important part of the story.
Yeah, that's so cool. I mean, it's like to me that that's a lifetime achievement right there. Is like to have a book, your own book event at the Strand. It's like a lot of people have different markers of like, when I've made it, but that seems like one of them, like
Yeah.
as a New York person especially.
Yeah, it's an institution, and it's not and for all that people or any of us could criticize the Strand for, because now it's this huge, bookstore. It took a lot to get to that point. It's not to be a bookstore and have that kind of fame and influence is amazing, and not easy to accomplish.
How did you how did you sort of pick your bookshops? Because I would think there would be a lot of choices, and it seems like, you're hitting on certain themes and there's kind of a chronological element. I love that you start with like Benjamin Franklin and like the sort of I don't know, bookshops as tied to the American Revolution. But were there bookstores that you had in mind that you had to cut and you thought like, oh, this has to be there, but it doesn't, I don't have room for it?
Yeah, is the hardest decision, was the kind of organization and thinking about which stores to include and which ones not to. And I try to sort of have profile march somewhat chronologically, but also profile different kinds of stores that spoke to different kinds of themes that were important in that particular moment in American history. And there's lots of good reasons to have chosen other places that I did. Some of it was constrained by archival sources. I didn't want to write a chapter if I didn't feel like I had really good material. Some of it just changed over time. You write a book for this project. I wrote a proposal and sold the book on the proposal, and then just wrote the book. And then as I was finishing it, I looked back at the proposal and realized there were like two chapters that I didn't write that I said I was going to write. And I
Uh,
can't remember, like, things just didn't fit or seem like they did. One example that I originally planned to write about, I was excited about the college bookstore, because,
mm,
well, I work at a university, and the college bookstore, I like to joke that somebody should vandalize the sign and put little quotations around the word bookstore,
yeah.
because it doesn't read like a bookstore at all. But I know from my research that it used to be, not particularly, I'm not talking about my campus, but just as an institution, the bookstore was often the kind of intellectual beating heart of a university, and not just places where other faculty or authors would come and give talks, but where students would hang out and would get books, not just the ones assigned for their particular class, but were really bookstores. And I did some research at Harvard, and they have this very famous bookstore, and there were these great like catalogs from the 1940s where they would sell market books, read Shakespeare or whatever, but it would also the place where you would get your blazer, and it was like how to be a Harvard gentleman. And it was hand in hand. The books were a part of it. It wasn't the whole story, but the bookstore was part of this education that the university offered, this 4 year experience. It was a really critical node on campus in ways that it has ceased to become, even at elite institutions. So I thought that was a really interesting story,
Yeah,
but I
there,
just
there,
ran.
They sell
ran out of
sweatshirts now, and
yeah,
I'm a UC Santa Barbara dad, that sort of
exactly.
stuff. I
Many of
recently.
them got taken over by Barnes and Noble's like management in the 90s and
Oh, that's
2000s.
funny.
And then, yeah, they're very popular places for prospective students and then admitted students to buy merch. But
Um, in terms of the sort of overall history of bookstores. I felt like, oh, okay, am I going to read a history of decline here and be like sort of like sad the whole time I'm reading your book because bookshops aren't what they used to be and they've been sort of assassinated by Amazon. But that's not really a story you tell, right? I mean, what do we think? How do we diagnose what's going on with bookstores now? Because I just saw I think it was either the Times or the Wall Street Journal last week, the guy Daunt, that
mhm,
the UK bookseller that is involved with Barnes and Noble. Did he take over? Is he part of
he's
the
the CEO.
right?
It's a hedge fund that bought Waterstones, which is the UK chain.
Right.
He owns Daunt Books in the UK, and now Barnes and Noble is part of this conglomerate.
So what the article was saying was that there's this surprising resurgence with Barnes and Noble, and one of the things has made it successful, they think, beyond the engaging with the like book talk and like the TikTok market, which I think you write a little bit about that in your
Mhm.
book, but also they say that he's given like a kind of like looser leash to the booksellers themselves, and they're allowed to sort of like develop their own culture, their own like kind of local culture at each Barnes and Noble, and that's definitely happening at the Barnes and Noble in my town, which I go to all the time now, and I think about it a lot. And your book is there, like up front. Still, I think I saw it last week. But either way, what do you think about that? Because it seems like Barnes and Noble has like sort of they couldn't have possibly read your book, but they're
Well,
kind of
I did
building
interview
on that.
James
Yeah.
Daunt, so
Okay.
he may have read it. And I interviewed Len Riggio, who was the
Yep.
person who turned Barnes and Noble into the giant chain that it was. So when he bought it, it was relatively regional and small. And that was one of the most interesting interviews I did. He recently died. A billionaire, very charismatic guy. And this was one of these like pinch me, like, what am I doing in his Manhattan art gallery, like talking to this guy about Barnes and Noble, asking him about You've Got Mail. But really interesting guy. And so is James Daunt, who I also had. I can't believe these people let me interview them, but that was another part of the story. Um, yeah, there's a kind of irony, and James Daunt leans into it that Barnes and Noble, as he says, is trying to be more like an indie bookstore. And
Hmm.
he has some cred because he started Daunt Books in the UK. This very successful. I don't know how many branches there are, but these are indie bookstores, much beloved. So he has some credibility in that regard and is like, this is what I want to build here and turn Barnes and Noble more into something like an indie. And I mentioned before, some of that was getting rid of some of the non-book junk and at least slimming it down. A lot of it is just being more browser friendly, lots of face out books that you can easily browse and come across, and not being the superstore that it once was. So some of the new shops that they're opening have smaller footprints, not as many titles, but easier to see the titles, and not being a place where you can just get any book because Amazon exists now. So why does a bookstore need to be that kind of place, but rather should be a place of discovery? So they opened, I think, 60 shops last year and plan to do the same in 2025. This was in 2024. I was the ribbon cutter for one of these
No.
stores in Georgetown, Washington,
Amazing.
D.C., which was also very bizarre. And I was like, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and then I married this indie bookseller and Barnes. And I was like, am I supposed to be doing this? Is this okay? And, back to our sort of earlier discussion about
Yeah, they
how
were the
Barnes and Noble
villains. Yeah.
is seen. But the shop, honestly, the one that opened in Georgetown, which has this new design model that all their new stores have, was gorgeous. and as, you know, physically beautiful and as kind of attractive as almost any bookstore. Um, and they're really well done. And I think they are improved experiences, and people are resonating with them. So it gets to the question of, what is the sort of story in it? And this is where maybe the academic historian comes in. It's complicated. And
Hmm.
it is. It's not an easy, it's not a simple story of the declension model that we learned about. And it's not all rosy either. And it was a hard thing to write about because lots of what is written about it are these, kind of journalistic pieces that are either the bookstore's dead or they're gravitating to and exaggerating some piece of positive news because people like reading about the resurgence of indie bookstores. And it's complicated. There are bookstores. Barnes and Noble is doing much better than it's done since its heyday. There are many indie bookstores that are doing better than they've ever done. And yet, there are also way fewer bookstores today than there were 20 years ago. And I don't think we're going to get back to that number or 30 years ago. And in many, it's very geographically divided. There are a lot of bookstores doing very well in New York City, in lots of other affluent places. But there aren't nearly as many bookstores as there used to be in most places in the United States. And it's still an amazingly difficult and challenging and precarious business to be in. So there has been a resurgence, but it was a resurgence from a bottom. And we're somewhere in a kind of a world in which there are bookstores that can thrive
Yeah.
and do well. But it's still a landscape in which it's very difficult with lots of barriers and lots of bookstores that aren't doing well and that can't survive for very long.
Yeah, there isn't a clickbaity answer. I think it's very easy to say things like, "Well, no one reads anymore." Whenever I go to bookstores, especially the Barnes and Noble that's in our town, it's a lot of young people are in there. A lot of young people have been reading books. So yeah, I think that what you said just now about a place of discovery seems like it's a major part of the bookshop, a place that um, you feel like you're going to find something that you haven't known before or you haven't seen before. And that part of it seems key because in a world where the internet makes it feel like everything has been mapped and like everything is known and you can just look it up on Wikipedia and that's that.
Yeah.
The fact that there could be a space, even if it's Barnes and Noble, that you could walk into and find something you don't know, it's what drives like lately, like there's a in the wintertime, there's a lot of time after dinner for my wife and I, and it's like, well, it's 6:30. We already ate because we're old people. And like, what should we do? Well, let's go to Barnes and Noble. And the idea behind it, if there is, it's that I'm going to find something that I don't know
Yeah.
about yet. And that seems like a big part of what your book is getting at one way or the other, is that there's a special element to that
Yeah.
maybe that's what will keep the bookstore alive in a time when
I hope
uh
so. It's
yeah.
fun to go and see something, or Amazon or algorithm can recommend books to you, but there's something joyous upon you finding it yourself or somebody there telling you. And it's amazing. I've seen this happen so many times. You walk into a bookstore and the person there says, I love this book, and they put it in your hands.
Yeah.
You're going to buy that book. Like, that's amazing. And it feels, that transaction feels in one way so intimate, but in another way just so powerful and
Mm,
provocative and like great. It's just human in a
yeah.
way that buying books on Amazon isn't. And if there's hope for the future of the bookstore, it's that we will crave that humanity and seek it out.
Yeah, I mean it's similar with Spotify and music, I think. You sort of like, I don't want just the thing that the machine knows me somehow or thinks it knows me because it's collected everything I've ever put into my phone and it thinks, here's what about the people that don't know me? What do they
Mm.
recommend? What about the people that are just recommending a book because they think it's great? There's a place that you could have profiled it here in Ojai, California, called Bart's Bookstore. It's a big outdoor used bookstore that's sort of got
Okay.
a courtyard, and they have like hundreds of thousands of titles. I mean, it's sort of like an unbelievable space. You walk through a house, like the kitchen is all filled with cookbooks. There's a just a million novels in their fiction section. I mean, it's kind of an unbelievable space, but they have a recommended sort of section by the employees there, and that's the first place I go every time I go
Yeah.
in there. And I have found countless books that are on the bookshelves behind me that sort of changed my life one way or the other because they were recommended by people that didn't know me, and they were just sort of like, "Look, this is a cool book," and that's something that you can't get online. You can't get with an algorithm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Evan Friss, I want to say the name of your book again. It's a pretty simple title, The Bookshop: A History of the American Bookstore. And I cannot tell you how much I learned from this book and how much I enjoyed it. I thank you for talking with me.
Yeah. Thanks for finding it, discovering it,
That's
and
right.
reading it.
I did discover it at a small bookshop. So yeah, they still have value. Thank you. All right, folks, I think that's going to wrap it up for Nostalgia Trap this week. I want to thank my guest, Evan Friss, for talking with me about his book, The Bookshop: A History of the American Bookstore. I cannot recommend it enough. I learned a ton from this book, and it also gave me a little glimmer of hope, not only about independent bookstores and Barnes & Noble and that sort of thing, but also just kind of the larger fate of people who read in this country, because it is a very particular population. You know who you are. I think there are probably many Nostalgia Trap listeners who are voracious readers like me, and you probably understand the value of the bookshop, and I wonder what you think about it. So let me know in the comments. Please check out our Patreon page. The link is in the episode description. We will be back next week with more News Trap and lots more episodes. So thank you so much, and we will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.